Good morning, folks. I'm going to take this opportunity to basically do a recap of my discussion on the book of Genesis for the benefit of those who, were out last week because of COVID or for whatever reason that you may have been out. Um, Also, for my own posterity and for the benefit of those who may happen upon this on YouTube. Um, in any case, so as the video that I asked you to look at, points out, this text, the Torah, the first five books, the books of Moses, known as the Torah, the Pentateuch, depending upon one's perspective and so on and so forth, uh, essentially became codified in its more or less present form around 600 BCE in the time of King Hezekiah. The prevailing theory right now, and this is a relatively new theory, um, is that the uh, Book of Deuteronomy, which of course the narration about that being discovered is in fact in the biblical text, but the Book of Deuteronomy would have been the first sort of complete cohesive text there, and then the other texts that form the rest of the Pentateuch would have been redacted onto that, grafted onto that, and what sort of woven together from various sources. The primary sources being the what's generally referred to as the J text or the Yahwist text, um, and the E text or the Elohist text, and these texts are essentially products of two different prevailing tribes, two different geographical locations. Because, as most people are aware, historically, there was very only actually probably a very short time that what we understand to be Israel was ever really united as a single kingdom in ancient times. That you're talking about the north, Israel, and the south, Judah. Um, and So you have, of course, in the north, Shiloh being the center of religious life, and then in the south you have Jerusalem, right? And in the south you've got the three tribes, you know, verses 9 to 10 tribes, depending on the number, right? In the north, but the major tribe of Judah is being in the south. But in any case, so these texts were redacted together, along with sort of some priestly revisions, um, you know. But the main point here is that the evidence for this is in the stylistic differences throughout the text strains, as well as the fact that, for example, as we read in the Genesis excerpt, right, you've got Abraham essentially trying to pass his wife off as his sister twice, right, which shows that he's not. If one is to read this as a cohesive text, which as literary scholars we do, right? We look at this as a narrative, not so much as in a theological context, but in a narrative context. Um, as Harold Bloom points out in his book of J, right? Uh, Abraham's not too bright, because he tries to pass his wife off as his sister twice, and of course in each case a plague results, and so on and so forth, and you know he but then of course he says, well, she is my sister, she's my half sister. Well, in any case, let me back up a bit. So with Genesis, and most of you are aware, there are two distinct creation stories there. The first one humankind is created, male and female are created simultaneously. And arguably, the emphasis of that first creation narrative, right? And that's where you have the 7 days. And of course, famously William Jennings Bryant, in the Skoke's monkey trial, he told, proclaimed the exact date, based on mathematical calculations and so on and so forth, that the Earth was created and whatnot. But anyway, the you have those 7 days there, and really the emphasis here, and really the revolutionary idea, if you will, is that of the Sabbath, the idea of this day of rest, because particularly the ancient world, and really up until the latter half of the 20th century, the idea of taking a day off was just preposterous, right? Um, you know, so this is kind of an interesting point here. The second creation story is the one that we're most familiar with, and is hotly debated, has been for centuries, right? That Adam was created and so forth, and then Eve is taken from his rib or his side, depending on the translation, and so on and so forth. Um, so let me just kind of interject an aside here. Um, so again, reading this as a cohesive text, the rabbis during the second diaspora period, right, during the um, after the second temple period, right, when really, because there was no central place to do traditional sacrifices and so forth, and even before that, because it wasn't really practical, for a whole lot of people to go to the temple. I mean, people did, of course, but the vast majority of one's religious life and the vast majority of one's interaction with these texts, right, took place in the synagogue, right? And in fact, we even see, and we'll talk about this when we get to the gospel narratives much later on in the course. But Jesus is teaching in the synagogue and so on and so forth. But in any case, the text becomes paramount, such that the text itself and the study of the text becomes equated with temple sacrifice and with the presence of God, or the divine, and so on and so forth, such that you have Kabbalah, which ultimately comes to fruition in 12th century CE Spain. Um, you know, uh, but you have the beginnings of it in diaspora Judaism, such that you know you had these parts of the text, these phrasings in the text where would mention particular emotions or so on and so forth. And so if a reader were to be reading that and came across a particular statement or a particular phrase or a particular metaphor in the Kabbalistic attribution system, then that person would then understand that um, that is the evidence of the presence of the divine in the text, and the text as a via medium to connection to the divine in the same way that the temple had been. So now my whole point there, right? So hopefully I haven't lost you yet, but my whole point there is that the rabbis would read this as a cohesive text, and they would take it extremely seriously, and they weren't necessarily concerned with how this was all redacted together from different oral traditions and so on and so forth, but they were looking at it as a cohesive text. And now, honestly, as we're doing, right? So if you look at this, And you see, okay, in the first creation story, you've got man and woman created, and then it breaks down to the creation of Adam, followed by the creation of Eve. How does one reconcile this, if indeed this is a cohesive text? So what this is the genius, if you will. This is the beauty of the rabbinical tradition, is that the rabbis narrate the gaps. They created story, right, to fill in the gaps, and and so what they came up with, of course, if you're familiar with if you're familiar with Jewish literature, you will find references like, for example, Bernard Malamon's The Fixer. You'll find references to what I'm about to talk about. That's a 20th century novel, but also, if you're familiar with vampire, sort of the vampire uh, craze of the couple of decades ago, and so on and so forth, um, vampire fiction and so forth. There's this figure called Lilith. Well, so Lilith, the rabbis said was, and of course, she was she was a god, Mesopotamian goddess figure as well. And but anyway, the rabbis said, well, uh, Lilith, right? She was Adam's first wife, and she was dark haired. She was not submissive to Adam. She would not submit to Adam sexually, so on and so forth. So what does Adam do? He goes and, you know, does what a lot of whiny, inexperienced folks do. They go and they complain to their parents and say, the life is not working out for me, and so on. So he goes and he complains to Yahweh, right? Not to offend anyone who is conservative or Orthodox Jew who may be listening to this and is offended by the pronunciation of that name. We could also say Adonai, right? So he goes to Adonai and says, well, uh, this woman is not working out. So Lilith is then cast out, and it becomes the queen of demons, and so on and so forth, and SIDS and so on, and sudden infant death and these kinds of things. These are attributed to Lilith, or had been in medieval and previous before that Jewish communities. And so you will have, see little charms and so on and so forth to ward off Lilith. But in any case, and so then Eve is then created, and she supposedly is submissive to Adam. But backing up just a little bit, also sort of what's interesting about the creation story, and this is not originally mine. This is, scholars have pointed this out, that the moon, the sun and the moon are identified as lights in the sky, right? So what's interesting here is they're not identified as divinities, and so this would be distinguishing sort of the Genesis narrative with which is a monotheistic narrative, with other narratives in having come before it, right? And from which it's drawing upon. It's drawing heavily upon the defeat of Tiamat, or chaos, right? And if you're familiar with D&D, then you know about Tiamat, the multi-headed dragon, and so forth. Well, she comes from Mesopotamian myth, and she's ultimately the goddess of chaos. She's defeated by Marduk, and then her body ultimately, Marduk uses the body of Tiamat to create the earth. But in this, you don't have the battle and so forth, and so all that. But it is there's some carryover there, and there's also some relationship between some of the Egyptian creation stories with the formation of human beings out of dirt, out of clay. And we will also see that referenced in the Epic of Gilgamesh when we look at that this week. But so, in any case, then of course we have this figure of the serpent, and the serpent kind of gets a bad rap in a lot of cultures, right? Particularly in Mesopotamian and so forth. The serpent is sort of synonymous with female spirituality, female, in part because the serpent sheds its skin, just as women, of course, menstruate monthly and shed their uh, blood and so forth, blood and skin cells and so forth, and so a lot of people. I mean, this is not new, right? This has been talked about for 150 years or at least, but that it's that what Genesis represents in part is the supplanting of a much earlier matriarchal um, conception with a patriarchal one, and you have to understand too that contrary to popular assumption, Israel, the whole Judean situation, right, was not monotheistic. It was not monolithically monotheistic. I'll say that until uh, the time of Hezekiah, right? Until around 600 BCE. Of course, monotheism existed, but there were also, the worship of Ishtar or Aseroth, and so on and so forth. And of course, that's very strongly condemned in the biblical text. And actually, there's evidence that suggests that Aseroth or Ishtar was understood to be the wife of Adonai, prior to this push for strict monotheism. And so, and also, of course, and the big tension, of course, that runs throughout a lot of the prophetic writings and so on and so forth, is that the the Hebrew people do not live in a vacuum, right? So they're always exposed to other cultures and so on, and really that becomes problematic if you happen to have a very, very conservative religious bent, as a person in ancient times, and you want your people to remain sort of loyal to a particular vision, but they're being exposed to all these various cultures and so on and so forth. What do? You create a narrative that privileges what you want it to privilege. So um, the Bible as a whole, the Hebrew Bible as a whole, irrespective of the Christian tradition, but the Christian tradition as well is incredibly political. And we can look at, for example, the Abraham story. We can see that, right? So, um, as the story goes, um, Adonai speaks to Abram at that time, and says, "Hey, go over here. Take your flocks and all your people and so forth, and go into this land, and I'm going to give you this land." Um, Interestingly enough, the lands that Abraham are promised are essentially the lands of folks that the Hebrew people ultimately get into wars with, right? And so we can hold this up to our own history, right? If there's a kind of manifest destiny, if you will, where we're supposed to occupy this land, it can be used to justify all sorts of nefarious things. And so if you think about Someone in the time of 600 BCE or so, looking at the national culture of Israel or whatever, right? Looking at that and saying, well, and really wanting to keep this northern and southern kingdom united and friendly and all this kind of stuff, but also, hey, we have a right to these lands because God gave them to us, right? So, but anyway, and you see in the Abraham story, right? Um, First of all, again turning to the midrash or that which the rabbis kind of narrate to make sense of everything, right? Um, Interestingly, and we'll talk more about the flood story. I know I'm kind of jumping around here, but we'll talk more about the flood story when we get to Epic of Gilgamesh. One thing I do want to point out, and I actually forgot to point this out in class, right, is the rainbow in the sky. That is it's kind of a funny the humor of that is kind of lost on us. The in our culture in our day, because in the ancient times the bow, right, it was a symbol of tended to be a symbol of masculine virility, right? So Adonai placing the rainbow in the sky is essentially saying, well, Noah, you're surviving and everything, but remember who remembers who's got the biggest stick, if you will, right? So, and we will see this, right, and this is going to come up again in the Svayambara of Sita, right? In the Ramayana, we're going to see Ram break the bow of Shiva, um, and Vaishnavas will take that for depending on how you choose to date the Ramayana, will take that for thousands of years as the primacy of Vishnu over Shiva. But and we'll see it again too in the Odyssey when Telemachus, the son, is unable to string the bow of his father. So the point there is that, hey, dad is old, but dad is still dad. Dad is still as the Romans would say, the paterfamilias, right? But in any case, yeah, also too, um, there's some funny stuff in here, right? For instance, does anybody know how small a fig leaf is? Right? You can imagine, this is that they string fig leaves together, but practically, if you envision that, visually, it's like, they're trying to clamor and put fig leaves on or whatever. That's they're, if you will, their junk is hanging out. I mean, it's they're not covering anything, you know, which metaphorically you can look at in a number of different ways. But so anyway, we get to the Tower of Babel story, um, and of course the rabbis, they don't want Yahweh to be a dick, right? They don't want because basically, the way that this is narrated is that, okay, so human beings are are organized, they're building this tower, and if they and of course, and this is a big controversy here, is that the one of the primary names for Adonai that's used is El or Elohim. El is singular. El is the same. This is the Hebrew version of the Arabic Allah. So that's actually the same word. Whereas Elohim is plural, and of course, plural for a singular divinity. So of course, throughout history, there's been a number of ways to explain this. One being the angelic court, the other being like the royal we, for example. But I don't know if that was a convention in 600 BC, or actually even prior, because remember these began as oral traditions over many years. But and of course, in Christianity, Christians would pick this up, and it would be the Trinity, right? Of course, the Trinity is not ever explicitly mentioned anywhere in the Bible, but we'll get to that later. But it took about 400 years. It took about 300 years, 400 years to really codify the Trinity as a doctrine. But in any case, you know, so the way that the rabbis talk about kind of work this out is they say, well, uh, if they were building this tower, right, over so many years and whatever, it had to be that resources, a brick, for example, would become more valuable than a human life, and so if a brick dropped, then people would weep and lament. But if a person fell off the tower, then oh well, there's just another person to come up. So what the Midrash tells us is that is what causes ultimately Adonai to destroy the tower, right? But it really the confounding of the languages, that's something that is profoundly terrifying in a way, because to me personally, I mean, what is more terrifying than trying to convey your thoughts, your feelings, and so forth via language, and not being understood, because language is the means by which we make our reality real to someone else. We give them that window by which they can re-envision our reality for themselves, and thereby connecting with us in some sort of empathy, right? But if our language is totally confounded, that's not going to happen. And so anyway, um, so Abram is doing his thing, and ultimately he's told, well, I'm going to change your name to Abraham, and I'm going to change your wife's name from Sarai to Sarah. And here we get the importance of the convention of naming, that in a name, in a pronouncement of a name, there is life. And so that will become interesting. It's again this idea that language carries with it the potential for change, the potential for um, uh, vitality, if you will. So we have the whole, and I realize I'm jumping around. I don't have notes in front of me. I'm just kind of revisiting what we talked about in class and so forth. But so you have the whole Abraham the gangster moment where he, stuff is stolen from him, and he goes off and he kills off a whole bunch of people, and so on and so forth, strings them up on trees and whatnot. This is a very gangster moment, unapologetically, and this is why fundamentalism. This is an example of why fundamentalism is quite disturbing, because if someone were to read that literally, and they might feel justified in doing something similar, because it's in their holy text or whatever, and that is bothersome. But in that instance, you have the whole notion of someone who is strung up on a tree being cursed, and so on and so forth, and that carries through to the crucifixion and so forth later on for Christians, because it's not as though, I mean, historically, there's a difference between this. So there's several different layers, of course. You have the literary, you have the historical, chicken or the egg. Historical, literary, theological. These are different, right? So, but the reading of the Hebrew scriptures through the Christian lens actually, of course, happened after the life of Jesus. But anyway, we'll get into more of that. Um, so there's the whole Sodom and Gomorrah instance, and of course, this is one of the most controversial points, controversial scenes in the Bible. First of all, 99, most serious scholars agree this has nothing to do with homosexuality. Nothing at all. What it has to do with is the violation of the hospitality ethic. Hospitality was absolutely essential in the ancient world, all over the ancient world. In fact, when we see in the Odyssey, when we get to the Odyssey, people are rolling out all the stops for Odysseus before they even know his name. He just happens to be a wanderer. But he is essentially treated like family, and that is the ethical requirement of civilized society. In fact, in India, still to this day, if you are of a spiritually minded person, a Brahminically minded person, you are supposed to, bare minimum, give a guest a place to sit and water, minimally. Um, in any case, so these folks, and in fact, depending on your translation, you've either got three angelic beings, or you've got one of them is in fact Adonai, right? Depending, and so you have them essentially they're going to sleep in the town square, which is typical for travelers and so forth. But Lot, he says, "Oh no, come in and stay at my place." Well, the people, they essentially want to violate them. They want to rape them, etc., etc. And Lot's like, "No, you can have my daughters. You can do this and whatever." But of course, um, and uh, Adonai's response is, "Well, I'm going to destroy the city." And it's interesting because he's like, "Well, should I tell Abraham about this? I don't know, because I know he's not going to like it." Um, and then it's very interesting what happens, because what you have here, even though the primary Jewish narrative, if you will, is foundation narrative, if you will, is the Exodus story. One of the reasons that I wanted to include Genesis rather than Exodus is because of this moment here where Yahweh where Abraham essentially argues with Yahweh and says, "Well, what if there are this many righteous here? What if there are this many righteous?" And basically argues him down. And Yahweh says, "Well, fine. If there's one righteous, then I'm not going to destroy." So basically, that Lot ends up being given an out. But this notion of struggling with the divine, right? This is fundamentally Jewish. This is the character of Judaism to this day, right? Um, that the human being is to struggle with the divine, to figure stuff out, and ultimately, you get into the idea of tikkun olam, that the individual is to work with the divine to repair that which is broken. Um, you know, so in any case, um, Lot's given an out, and and his wife turns around and looks back, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. Now, if you've seen what a pillar of salt looks like, particularly from that part of the world, it does. Pillar of salt looks like a woman. So you can imagine that the authors or of the original oral story looked at the pillar of salt and they're like, oh, that's a woman, you know, that's a woman. So, but what strikes me is the comparison, for example, between the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, right? Where Orpheus, who is the most brilliant, his wife Eurydice dies, and Orpheus, who's the most brilliant musician in the world, right? He goes down to the underworld and he sort of pleads his case before Hades and Persephone. And Persephone kind of feels bad for him, and it goes and tells Hades, well, why don't we give her back? Why don't we let Eurydice go back? So they let Eurydice go back, but they say, well, if you look back, you know, if Orpheus looks back and sees at Eurydice behind him before they get out of the underworld, then she cannot go out. And ultimately he does, and she. So what does this mean? Well, metaphorically, right? This is each of us, right? There's always the temptation to look back. There's always the temptation to pause and think about, the way things, you did things in the past, um, um, or how you screwed up before, or how you did this. There's always that tendency to the temptation, if you will, to look back. And what ultimately, what this narrative could be saying is, don't allow yourself to be calcified, right? To be turned into that pillar of salt. Move forward, right? Yesterday is gone, etc., right? Not to say that there's not more than one way to read this stuff. There's countless ways to read this stuff, and that's why, in part, people have been reading it for a long, long, long time. But anyway, so then we get to this curious thing about Lot's daughters getting him drunk and trying to copulate with him, and so, and scholars both religious and otherwise have made a lot out of, well, for all Lot's daughters knew, the entire world was destroyed with Sodom and Gomorrah. So because that essentially was their world, more or less. But to me, I mean, I see that as very much the making the run on the toilet paper during the first week of COVID, right? Uh, uh, it's just a total overreaction, right? And again, we read this stuff and we can see ourselves in this. We can write ourselves into the story, and thereby the story has meaning, right? Um, so anyway, you have Abraham. He's promised a son. He's old. His wife over here, uh, laughs and so on and so forth. It's interesting that he's actually given that information by depending on the translation, by God Himself, right, and to companions, and so. But here's the interesting part to me, again, to me, and let me back up a little bit. Previously, Hagar, the um, slave, if you will, was or the I think she's an Egyptian, but anyway, she's pregnant with Ishmael. Well, in Ishmael is said to be the father of the progenitor of various peoples and so forth. Well, when we get to the Quran, we'll see that Ishmael is the one who inherits the promises of Abraham, because Muhammad and the Prophet and so forth, then he and his people are descended from the peoples connected with Ishmael. So in that narrative, Ishmael becomes primary. But when you look at Isaac, right, and the whole thing with Isaac, um, so what a lot of people don't take into account with that, of course, the famous thing with Isaac is that he's Abraham takes him up, and Yahweh basically sets him up to be sacrificed. Well, if you watched the films with this with Isaac and so forth, you're looking at this little kid walking up walking with his father and so forth, and they go to the mountain and so forth. This He was not a little kid, right, in the narrative. He was about 30 something years old. So Isaac knows exactly what's happening here. So it makes it a little bit more precarious in some ways, and also slightly a little bit more absurd in other ways. And ultimately, too, I mean, Yahweh's a straight up, uh, um, essentially potential sociopath here, right? I mean, he's he tells his friend and his servant Abraham to essentially kill his son, sacrifice his son, and then he's like, "Oh, just kidding," right? Can you imagine, going to a job and being like, having something like it honestly, it reads of um, Jim Jones used to have these white knight drills where he would essentially drill his his followers on committing mass suicide, and he would do this over a number of years, and it was always fake, right? It was always a ruse until in fact it wasn't, and that was the Jonestown thing. But honestly, you can see the character again, the literary character, not the literary character of Adonai. You can see him as kind of Jim Jones here, kind of culty here, right? Um, so there's a scholar named Jack Miles who makes a lot of this. He's a literary scholar who his big claim in his book God a Biography is that if one reads the uh, Hebrew scriptures in the order that Jewish people read them, which is a different order than the Christian order, right? The Christians order the books so that essentially the last notion in the Hebrew Bible ordered the way Christians order it is, I will bring unto you a new Elijah. And of course, the new Elijah becomes John the Baptist, so forth. In the Hebrew order, I shouldn't say Hebrew, the Jewish order, traditional Jewish order, the last notion is, go ye up unto Jerusalem, this kind of statement. The idea there is that, Yahweh's pretty much done. He's gonna, you know, you guys are left on your own. Is kind of the idea. Now, so what Jack Miles argues is that what you have throughout the Hebrew text, or again, order the way that the Jewish people read that, is that you have a Yahweh who ultimately matures and learns from his mistakes. So here, with the asking Abraham to sacrifice his son and so forth, this is a very sort of adolescent action. Oh, just kidding. You know, that's you don't engender loyalty test your friend's loyalty in that way. Who would want to be your friend after that, honestly, right? So Jack Miles contends that throughout the Hebrew scriptures um, you have Yahweh maturing and growing, as does humanity, right? Um, so Then we get into ultimately the story that I really like is the Jacob story in here. So fast forwarding right to Isaac's son Jacob, and Jacob and Esau are twins. Esau is furry, he's covered in. He's the first of our hairy sidekicks that we'll be talking about throughout the term. But he's brash, he's furry, and everything. He actually Jacob uh, tricks him out of his birthright because for a bowl of porridge, right, and so on. And of course, metaphorically, it's the porridge is red, Esau's hair is red, and so forth, red and furry, and so on. But so Harold Bloom again argues that the women in the Genesis narrative are the catalysts for all the major action. Because the great example here, of course, is uh, Rebecca, the mother of Jacob, saying, "Hey, your father's about to give his blessing. You know, put on this piece of fur and take your father this meal, right?" And so now, and he comes up and Isaac, who's blind, touches Jacob's arm and says, "Well, you have the voice of my younger son, but you feel like my older son." Now, Isaac might be blind, but he's not stupid. Arguably, he knows what's going on here, which again, of course, makes it kind of funny, right? It kind of makes it adds another dimension to it if Isaac's actually in on the deception. So he gives him blessing and whatever. But Jacob's afraid of his brother, and so he ends up going to his mother's brother, uh, Lamech, and we have this whole thing where he sees Rachel and he falls in love with Rachel immediately, and he says, "Well, hey, let me work for 7 years, and so I can marry your daughter." So he works for 7 years. Lamech prospers, so on and so forth. Because of course Jacob has the blessing of his father that comes down from Abraham, etc. So what we have here then it leads up to the funniest line, arguably, in the Bible. So Jacob has his wedding and so forth, and the next morning wakes he says, "It was Leah." Now, the reason this is funny is because, for example, if you look at an Indian wedding today, in a traditional Indian wedding, sometimes this wedding can go on for like a week. And so forth. Then the bride is veiled, oftentimes. So, and that would have been the case in the Semitic culture. The bride is veiled, and the wedding has gone on for quite a while, and everybody's intoxicated and having a great time. So, and she's still veiled when she goes into the bridal chamber and so on and so forth. And so he doesn't realize until the next morning that he, in fact, married the older sister, married Leah and not Rachel. So then, which is kind of hilarious. He turns around and looks, and it's not the sister that he thought it was. And so he goes to Lamech, who had tricked him, and he says, "Well, okay, fine. Um, uh, can I marry Rachel too, and work another 7 years?" So ultimately, after a week, he ends up marrying Rachel. And so, again, remember we talked about deconstruction, the idea of seeing elements in the text, seeing what the text is not, looking at the text in terms of what the text is not telling you, right? So here's an example of that. So we have um, Leah, and she keeps giving birth to all these sons, and Jacob is kind of laissez-faire about it because he's so in love with Rachel. And now flip that around and look at that from Leah's perspective. What must it have been like to be Leah? I mean, that is a tremendous degree of rejection. and so forth. So someone working with either deconstruction or feminist critique, which is sort of which is rooted in some ways in deconstruction, but would have a lot to say about Leia and how she fares or doesn't fare. Then, of course, and I promise to wrap this up. We're almost at an hour here, and I've got to go teach here in a few minutes. But the sort of culminating event for Jacob is when he's going to go confront his brother. Instead of falling out with the father-in-law, he goes to confront his brother, and he's worried about his brother ultimately kicking his ass for no other term at this point at this time of the morning. But ultimately, he and his brother reconcile. But before that, he ends up fighting with, and depending on the translation, right? It's either he's wrestling an angel or he's wrestling God, actually wrestling God, and of course, Jacob says, I will not let you go until you bless me. I will not let you go until you bless me. And again, this is the character of it's a metaphor for the character of Judaism, that you know is the human being and God wrestling for this life, and so what's interesting here is that first of all his socket is his hip is sort of pulled out of socket, so he ends up having this permanent limp, which that in and of itself, metaphorically, represents being divinely changed, being if you look at, for example, we'll look at the Hamaval later on, and Odin of course loses an eye to get the knowledge of the runes. It's after he gets the knowledge of the runes that he writes the Hamaval, or he's and so forth, so on and so forth. But he's blind. He's blinded in the eye, and so he's got divine vision. So you see that with Tiresias, the divine prophet, so on and so forth. Again, you may see that with Isaac, and the fact that he, when he's blind, he may be in on the whole ruse with Jacob. But anyway, the angel tells him, your name is no longer Jacob; it's Israel, the one who has fought with God, wrestled with God, and won. Right. So, and you can make a lot with this if you are want to explore queer theory. A lot of queer theorists and queer authors have done a lot with Jacob wrestling the angel. If you are familiar with Tony Kushner's Angels in America, one of the main characters in that is a Mormon, young Mormon lawyer who is gay, closeted gay, and he works with Roy Cohn, who sort of the irony is that Roy Cohn is also closeted gay, and Roy Cohn is just a despicable person. If you're historically familiar with if you're familiar with the historical Roy Cohn, but anyway, the character, the Mormon character talks about being young and just staring at the picture of Jacob wrestling the angel, and how erotic that was, and so some people could see that as a homoerotic image. We will see that again when we get to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Enkidu is told to embrace Gilgamesh as a husband would embrace a wife, and so on and so forth. So there is a homoerotic underpinning between the relationship with Gilgamesh and Enkidu, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. Well, I hope that I haven't completely bored you all out of your minds. And anyway, this is for the benefit of those who were out due to COVID last week. And if you catch this on YouTube, if you're not in my class, whatever, hopefully you got something out of it. Anyway, thank you all very much.